I tell my students in the power class, when somebody says you are responsible for your career, take it seriously. You are responsible for your career. And that means you are responsible for developing the skills, including, frankly, the political/power skills that will make you successful in that career. Do not depend upon some paternalistic organization to take care of you, because they won't. And they told you that they won't. They explicitly tell you that. Believe them. And therefore, it becomes incumbent on you to build the social networks. That's a piece of power.
Hey everyone, welcome to the LinkedIn Presents Redefining Work podcast. I'm your host, Lars Schmidt, and today I'm really excited to be joined by Jeffrey Pfeffer. Jeffrey is an author, he is a professor at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and he's one of the leading minds in business who has been really kind of breaking grounds in a few different areas. And we're gonna get into two of those today. The first one I wanna cover with you is I wanna spend a little bit of time on your 2018 book, Dying for a Paycheck, because we met a few months back at an event in San Francisco at the Acadian Ventures Summit, and I really appreciated your perspective on what work is doing to us and the harm that it is causing in society. And so I wanted to just open up there. That book was published in 2018. Obviously, we've been through some things since then, as global pandemic and take your pick from a range of other challenges that society has faced over the last 6 years. But I'm curious, if you were to kind of, rework, maybe reboot that book today, how would it look different?
Well, Lars, first of all, thank you for inviting me on your podcast. The simple answer is that things would be worse. And COVID, as you know, so the premise of Dying for a Paycheck is actually quite simple. And there is probably 50 or 60 years of epidemiological research that demonstrates the adverse health effects of stress and depression. Stress and depression are empirically related, though they are not the same thing. And both of them have 202 kind of pathways for their effects. When you are stressed or when you are depressed, you are more likely to smoke. You are more likely to abuse alcohol. You are more likely to abuse drugs. You are more likely to overeat. You are less likely to engage in exercise or engage in various other forms of self-care. So one pathway that stress and depression affects health is through its effect on your own actions. The second pathway through which stress and depression affect health is through their effects on your central nervous system, which regulates your hormones. And so there are now actually studies that demonstrate the direct physiological effect of stress and depression on your hormones and your kind of immune system, etc. And of course, stress and depression also affect sleep, and we know sleep also affects health. So stress and depression are bad for people. They kill people. The sources of stress and depression, of course, have gotten worse in the last 6 years. We had COVID. People lost their jobs. People lost their income. But the last 6 years have fundamentally continued a trend that had begun years before, which is to make employment less secure. And by less secure, I mean if you are an hourly worker, you're now much more likely to find your schedule varying from week to week, and therefore your income varying from week to week, depending upon your bank or retailer or hotel's estimate for the demand for labor. Layoffs have continued apace, as we know. In the last 2 or 3 years, many of the tech companies, even though they have a ton of money, have engaged in layoffs. So layoffs, of course, are stressful and depressing. So employment insecurity has gone up. I think COVID itself was, of course, a source of stress and depression as people worried about their health and their families' health. And so we have seen, I think, an increase in the things that cause stress in the workplace. And frankly, I do not see, as I said when I first gave my first talk about Dying for a Paycheck, which happened to be in New Zealand, to a group of HR executives, in which I said, it's bad news that the workplace is killing people, But to me, the worst news is that nobody seems to care. And I believe that remains the same. You see the Surgeon General of the United States, Vivek Murthy, who's, by the way, a fan of this book, and he and I know each other, I think has put out a bunch of reports about mental health and other kind of issues. But in general, employers still do not take their employees' well-being seriously. And let me say one more thing. When you go to work, if you work for an employer, Salesforce or Microsoft or whoever it is, when you go to work, you have entrusted your mental and physical well-being to that employer. Is the leader going to be abusive? Is the leader, are you going to have proper work-family accommodations, et cetera, et cetera? You have trusted your well-being to that leader. And just like companies can be good or bad stewards of the physical environment, do they recycle? Are they carbon neutral, et cetera, et cetera? But employers can be good or bad stewards of the humans whose lives have been entrusted to them. And some are good stewards and many are not.
Yeah. I'm curious to get your perspective on how we change that, because I think even if you look back in the last, let's just say 4 years, right? COVID impacts everything. We as a society, kind of let alone work, we go through this period where maybe it wasn't that long ago that we are in kind of that glorification of hustle and grind, culture, and everybody, there's more busyness as a badge of honor. That was bullshit. We moved away from that. I think people spent more time with their families, obviously, as they were quarantining. A lot of priorities began to shift, perhaps in what people value and where they want to spend their time. And then, from there, we enter this period of, the economic resurgence, what we call the Great Resignation, right? The pendulum of power kind of swung over to the employees for a bit of time. We started having different conversations about mental health, workplace flexibility, remote and hybrid work. Then the economy shifts, power swings back in the hands of the employers. They wield that power with round after round of layoffs. And, even companies in tech where, as you mentioned, they had the funds, but they were still cutting, and they just kind of saw this broader cover in the economy that, hey, everybody's doing it. We're not really going to get dinged for it. Where does that leave us today, right? I mean, we're still kind of in this period of economic uncertainty. Layoffs seem to have tapered off a bit, though not completely. What is the path forward?
So I make an analogy between, as I already have, between the physical environment and the human or social environment. And if you think back, we did not get to where we are with cleaning up the air and the water and the ground by relying on companies to be good corporate citizens. In fact, the movement towards environmental, towards a cleaner physical environment came through litigation, regulation, and legislation. There was a Clean Water Act. There was a Clean Air Act. And by the way, what the environmental regulations recognized, which is true for the human environment as well, is that prevention is cheaper than remediation. Once I put stuff into the river, it's very expensive and hard to get it out. Once I put stuff into the air, it is very hard to get it out. It is much cheaper and more effective to cut pollution at its source, to put stuff on smokestacks, to recycle and to be good users of our natural resources, rather than to do a lot of environmental damage and then try to remediate it. That is exactly parallel to the truth of the human environment. Once I have stressed and depressed you, once you become a drug abuser or an alcoholic or God knows what else, it is hard for me to get you back to a state of health. So once again, prevention is cheaper than remediation. So I think that's the first thing that people need to recognize, and I think it makes common sense. The second thing people need to recognize is that almost all the progress on the physical environment began with legislation and regulation. We did not rely on Walmart to one day wake up and say, oh my goodness, if we put solar panels on all our flat roofs, we will save a ton of money. But in fact, there were various economic and regulatory inducements to encourage Walmart to be better stewards of the physical environment. I believe this is what it's going to take for the social environment as well. I don't know if you know this, but in France, French Telecom, now called Orange, decided that it needed to downsize, and it laid off a bunch of people, and the layoffs were stressful, and many people committed suicide, and there were other adverse physical consequences. And the French government actually arrested the CEO of Orange and the head of HR. They were tried and convicted. They're now, I believe, still appealing their conviction. As I have said, people, on the day that a district attorney goes in and arrests a CEO for murder because of how they've treated their employees, things will change. And until then, probably not much.
Yeah. I mean, I'm curious to get your thoughts. I know California recently proposed a right to disconnect law that mirrored legislation we've seen in Europe, in I think Ireland and 4 or 5 different countries there, around kind of contacting, not being allowed to contact employees outside of core hours. What's your perspective on that? Do you think that has a chance of going through in California, and could that perhaps be that first step of government regulation?
Yeah, I think it could be. I think employers, as you pointed out, Lars, I think you're completely correct. COVID changed a lot of things, and I think the other thing that has changed is the younger generations. The younger generations watched their parents and aunts and uncles and grandparents give their lives to companies that then laid them off, and reciprocated employee loyalty with no loyalty at all. And so many of the younger people say, I do not want to go to work for employers who are going to treat me is like some kind of disposable plastic cup, except they actually worry more about the plastic cup than they do about the employees. And so I do think there's a different relationship between employees and the workforce, which has caused, employers to have to worry more about accommodating employee interests. But I don't know how far that will go. I don't know. But there is I think the parallel again with the physical environment is quite strong. If I let Lars Schmidt put stuff into the air, water, and ground, it is often not Lars Schmidt who has to pay to clean it up. This becomes an externalized cost. If I let your employer make you ill, this also becomes an externalized cost, because when you drop out of the labor force because you are too physically and or mentally disabled to work, you then become a burden on society, and someone else has to clean up the damage that your employer has done, in very much the same way that people in the past had to clean up the physical environmental damage that companies were doing. And so people said, I don't want you to be able to externalize these costs to the larger society. And I think that's the same parallel for employee costs.
Yeah, I mean, that generational piece you touch on is, I think, very interesting and spot on, because I think we are, obviously we have 5 generations of the workforce today. I think when you look at some of these younger generations and you see the way they think about their priorities and, having interests outside of work, right? They don't want to die for a paycheck. They don't want
That's
their
exactly
life
correct.
to be associated with their job, right? They have other interests, and there's a range of stats that kind of talk about what the gig economy will look like in the next 5 years. But I think you are seeing, especially as there's no more the myth of the gold watch is over, right? So employees know that they are, even if you're at a place like Google or Meta or Apple, you're still expendable. You still can be on the receiving end of layoffs. There's no security necessarily anymore through any sort of employer. And so I think you'll start to see more people continue to say, well, I'm going to be the employer of me, and I will be more of a free agent. I will move around. That kind of fluidity of talent, I think, will change a lot, and perhaps put more pressure on companies to create environments that are more sticky, to be able to retain that talent, because it's so expensive to replace them. And I'm curious, like, do you see that playing out over the next several years, where perhaps the fluidity and mobility of talent will force companies to rethink how they develop in order to retain talent for obviously their motives are profit, but for continuity, how do you see them adapting to that?
Well, I'm not sure that they will. I mean, so if you look back historically, for Dying for a Paycheck, I had the privilege of interviewing the head of HR for Patagonia. There are companies, Patagonia being, I think, a very good example of this. Barry Waymiller with my friend Bob Chapman, who wrote a book entitled Everybody Matters, who actually understands this idea of stewarding and being a good steward of your employees' well-being. I think there have always been companies that have taken care of their employees as a matter of their core values, as a matter of how they think about being good stewards of the lives that have been entrusted to them. And there have been other companies, notoriously Merrill Lynch, which seems to always be having its interns die from overwork. Investment banking is notorious for this, where there is no concept of employee well-being, where they have this round tripping where you work all night and then you go home and take a shower and go back to work and all this other stuff. And, so I think it really comes down, frankly, to an issue of company values. It comes down to whether or not the company wants to be a good steward of the lives entrusted to it, or whether it basically says we don't care. And that, by the way, this is an interesting transition, which I don't know if you want to make this transition, but this is an interesting transition to the topic of power. Because fundamentally, what I say to my students is companies have for 40 or 50 years in the United States, in their personnel handbooks, have said, you are responsible for your career. The idea of lifetime or long-term employment is over. You're employed very much at will. Many employees have you sign an at-will statement. By the way, when you go to work for them, the United States is the only country in the world that has at-will employment, but that's a whole nother story. So you are responsible for your career. I tell my students in the power class, when somebody says you are responsible for your career, take it seriously. You are responsible for your career. And that means you are responsible for developing the skills, including, frankly, the political/power skills that will make you successful in that career. Do not depend upon some paternalistic organization to take care of you, because they won't. And they told you that they won't. They explicitly tell you that. Believe them. And therefore, it becomes incumbent on you to build the social networks. That's a piece of power. To build the personal brand. That's a piece of my book, 7 Rules of Power. To build the connections. To basically build the resilience that will make you that will make you economically and socially successful, almost regardless of what your employee does. One of the things I tell my students, which does not necessarily makes me popular with the students, but not necessarily with the companies, is, you ought to spend 10 to 15% of your time making sure that you have job options. So that if your boss gets fired and a new boss doesn't like you, if the company one day decides they're going to lay off 10 or 20 or 100,000 people, you have a safety net. And the safety net is your options. You need optionality. When you get on a plane, they're going to teach you about the oxygen masks and where the emergency exits are, because they know in an emergency, it's too late to do the teaching. And I tell people, employees, workers, that they have to think about this exactly the same way, that you need to know if something bad happens in your company, that you have options, that you have fallbacks, that you have people who will hire you in other places. And so you don't necessarily every day have to spend 10 to 15% of your time making sure that you have career and job options. But over a period of time, you need to make sure that you can leave if you need to.
Yeah. I mean, look, it's such great advice, because I think that what you saw a lot, especially with the layoffs in tech, where people thought those jobs were secure, their head was down. They were focused on the work. They weren't focused on building their network. Another point you obviously, touch on in the concepts of the principles of power. They weren't focused on building their brand. And so this now happens. Now they're flat-footed. Now they find themselves in a job market with a lot of other people, similar background, highly skilled. And the ones who had that advantage were the people who were investing some of that time, some of that energy in those things while they were working. And I think, kind of the concept of like the employer review, we meaning all workers have to be having that mindset of like, how are we continuing to grow? How are we building our learning agility? How are we staying on top of trends and developments? And then how are we building, I use the term a lot around network equity. And, I view that as like being very intentional around not just making time to network and build your network and being able to lean on that, but being intentional around what that network looks like and how it can complement your own skills and experience and what you're doing now and what you want to do in the future. Because when you've harnessed that, it's a collective intellect, and you're able to bring to bear all of that experience of that network equity that you've built to your company's problems or your own career, as opposed to just the knowledge you have in your head or your hands. So I think it's so spot on. When you think about, networking, power networking, some of those terms to some people may be loaded, right? They may feel that is, there's a negative connotation with that because they overlook the value that brings to their own career development. What do you tell students who might be, some of the ideas around like building a personal brand or building a network? If that is something that is maybe not in their comfort zone, how do you steer them towards getting out of their comfort zone, right? It's not necessarily making them comfort with them. It's making them see the importance of it, regardless of whether they're comfortable or not.
So I think there are two answers or several answers to that question. Number one, I use a bunch of executive coaches in both the online and on-campus versions of my class. And the part of the activity of those executive coaches is explicitly to help people get out of their comfort zone. I think you need, to do things that are initially uncomfortable to you. You need some level of coaching and social support. I think that makes the number one sense. And number two, on the very first day of the class, I talk about the stages of learning about power, and that it's going to begin with denial. This material doesn't apply to me, or it doesn't apply in high tech, or it doesn't apply in my culture, or it doesn't apply with their whatever. And then it's going to be followed by anger, often directed at me. How can you say such horrible things? And then it's going to be followed probably by sadness. This is the way the world is. It's, a tragedy. And if we are successful, and we are often quite successful over the 8 or 10 weeks, 8 weeks for the online class, 10 weeks for the on-campus version of the class, at the end, there will be acceptance. And acceptance is, this is the way the world is. I'm going to master power. I'm going to use it to advance my career and to enable me to get things done for the benefit of my organization and myself. And I'm not gonna, I'm just gonna come to terms with it. And so we talk explicitly about the stages and phases. I give them executive coaches to help them. I give them lots of written assignments, including, build your personal brand statement, and who are the 10 people who could be most useful to you, given the industry and or career you've defined for yourself. How are you going to meet them? So I have them not only learn the social science around networking and all the concepts around that, but also give them practice in doing it. And so we try to get them to turn their knowledge into actual action over the course of the quarter. And the amazing thing so the reason why my class has 100 people per section on the waiting list is not because I'm charming, which I can assure you I'm not, or not because of anything other than the students will use the number one word that I love about the class is not I've had a good time or it's enjoyable, but that it's transformational. This is a course which transforms people and transforms their trajectories. And I have people who come up to me and say to me, your class has I have one guy on lunch line one day who said, your class has made me rich. I didn't follow up with him to figure out how I did that, but in any event, but I have people come up to me and say, your class has fundamentally transformed my ability to get leverage with my startup, because this is not just people working for McKinsey or Goldman Sachs. This has transformed my ability to build my startup. This has transformed my career in whatever company I'm going back to, that this is transformational. So I'm in the business of transforming people's lives. And so that's why it's important, not And that's why it's so popular. Not because anybody particularly likes me, because I assure you I'm not very likable, but because the course material, if you will take it seriously, has an enormous effect. And so when that has that enormous effect, and the word goes out amongst the student body that this is a class that can actually do something for you during the time of the class. This is not material that you have to wait until you're, the senior vice president of X, Y, or Z to use. You can use it today. That's why the class and the course and the material is so popular. And by the way, I get emails about the books also. I have people who say to me, I read your book and I put it into practice and I got these amazing results. So there you go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's, the books could be a blueprint to that if you take that, seriously and kind of act on those steps. So I think that what I like about the steps towards power is that they're all timeless. They're going to be relevant well into the future. And one of the things that I want to explore with you a little bit is, you recently recorded a podcast with Lenny Rakitsky, and in it you were talking about some of the work that you were doing with the NFL, and specifically around, the imbalance of power and the fact that power often is largely held by those in power and less by underrepresented groups. And so there's an imbalance there. And I as I was processing that, I was thinking a bit towards some of the conversations that are happening in tech right now around this notion of meritocracy. And this theme that, several months ago, there was a memo from CEO of a startup company talking about how they're now a meritocracy and they always will be. And holding that up as if it was a new way of thinking about talent and building an organization. And I'm just curious, what do you think of when you see, CEOs, particularly in tech, kind of holding up this notion of meritocracy and often holding it up in a way that runs intentionally kind of counter to this notion of inclusion or DEI or however you want to frame that. I'd love to get your perspective on that.
During COVID, I went out to lunch with a bunch of, straight white guys. And some of them were not in my class. As a matter of fact, many of them were not in my class. And they said, we don't need your class because we're going to succeed anyway. And I think the people who most need to learn the power skills are the people who come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, who maybe are underrepresented minorities, who maybe are women working in a male-dominated world, who need to understand how the game is played and be willing to play it themselves. Now, you do not have to, not everybody has to be a football player or a tennis player or a hockey player or whatever your favorite sport is. But if you're going to play the game, you need to understand what the rules are. And you need to understand how other people are playing it. And you need to get yourself ready to do the best job you can. One of the readings that I assign in my class, it's kind of funny. Sam Borden in 2014 in the New York Times wrote an article about the U.S. men's soccer team and said the U.S. men's soccer team was much less willing, because they thought it was bad sportsmanship, to draw fouls.
Yeah.
And he talks about how Cristiano Ronaldo, if you watch the games, the soccer games, he barely touches him. He falls to the ground. He rolls over. He acts like he's dying as a way of drawing the foul. And, in a way of trying to make sure that if he's lost the ball, he's going to get it back. And the U.S. men's soccer team thinks that that's not, good sportsmanship. It's not appropriate. But his point was that if you're going to play world-class, world-lead soccer with Luis Suarez and Cristiano Ronaldo, you better understand the games and the techniques that they're using, and you need to be willing and able to use them yourselves, or else you're going to be at a disadvantage. And so, yes, over the years, the composition of my class has changed. There's now a higher percentage of underrepresented minorities and people from other countries and women in the class than there used to be, because I think they have come to understand that if they wait for the world to deliver them justice, they're going to be waiting a long time.
Yeah.
Some years ago, I gave a talk to about 150 powerful women lawyers, and I followed Irene Lang, who was at the time the CEO of Catalyst, and she had a talk in which the word should appeared many, many times about how we should treat women better and how women should have a higher percentage of equity partnerships in law firms and all kinds of things about what we should do with respect to women in the law. And my first comment, which did not necessarily make me popular, after following Irene, who's a woman who I know well and respect immensely, is I said, I'm not going to give you a single should in my talk. We should have a just and fair society. We should have a society in which there is not discrimination against people based upon their gender or their gender or their orientation or their race. But in the meantime, we need to learn the lesson of the civil rights movement, which is social change comes about when people get power. You know, Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, John Lewis, the heroes of the civil rights movement, did not wait for somebody to wake up one day and say, you know, how we are treating African Americans in this country is inappropriate and all kinds of things. They actually took proactive steps to ensure that discrimination would, to the extent they could get it to happen, would end. And so one of the things I used to, it's funny that we went down this particular path. I used to believe that my class called The Path to Power, or my online class called Building Power to Lead, or that the books I've written, like 7 Rules of Power, really contributed to people by teaching them the social science behind power and influence. I now believe that while that is true, the biggest contribution is to cause people to become more agentic, to cause people to say, I am not going to wait for the world to treat me fairly. I am not going to wait for the world to become more just. I am going to take action to ensure that I get the treatment that I deserve. You know, it goes back to this issue that we just talked about, you know, where companies have said, you're responsible for your career. If you're responsible for your career, you are responsible for doing the things that are going to make you successful, get you the promotions that you think you want and deserve. You can't just sit back and wait. So I think the number one contribution of my class and my teaching is to cause people to become more agentic.
Yeah. Look, I think you're right. And you're putting the power in the hands of the individual at that point, because they can take charge and take responsibility. Last question I have for you, Jeffrey. A lot of our audience are heads of people, chief people officers, CHROs, people running the HR, people, talent, whatever you want to call it, function within businesses. And there's been a lot of, mobility in that role over the last couple of years. And I'm curious, kind of taking your approach to power, what advice do you, and I know you've worked with a lot of HR executives, as you have with a lot of CEOs, so you kind of understand that dynamic. What advice do you have for a new CHRO moving into that seat on how they can quickly kind of establish, build and retain power within the business and their executive team?
Well, I think number one, since CHROs occupy what is by definition a staff role, and they have very little line authority and they have very little formal authority, they need to understand power dynamics. So the first thing I would say to them is you need to get educated on power. And which is interesting, I've given talks to groups of human resource executives who say, we went into human resources because we want to be the nice people. And I say, Leo DeRocher, the late baseball manager, had a statement entitled, basically, nice people finish last, which turns out to be, by the way, according to some research, empirically true. So I said, you cannot wait for people, you cannot wait to be given a place at the table. You cannot wait for somebody to recognize the brilliance of your ideas. You are basically in the sales business, as we all are. We are selling our ideas, we're selling our concepts, we're selling our perspective every day. You need to become more effective at that. So that's the first word of advice I would give them, is to become comfortable with power and get educated about it. Buy 7 Rules of Power, or whatever favorite book you want to buy. That's number one. Number two, the second thing I would tell them, it's interesting. So I gave a talk at a chief learning officer conference at Half Moon Bay. And these are senior learning officers from all the major companies. So I said to them, raise your hand if you have trouble retaining high potentials. And every hand goes up. Your high potential employees are having trouble. I said, keep your hand up. If the reason why you're trouble retaining high potentials is because many of your highly skilled people do not know how to manage organizational dynamics, so they are suffering career derailment. And of course, essentially every hand stays up because this is, if you have done a good job of selection and development, your workforce is highly motivated and highly skilled. And the reason why they get into trouble is their inability to manage organizational politics. So all these hands are still up. And I say, keep your hand up if given this recognition that you're having trouble retaining high potentials. And the reason why high potentials are having career derailments is because they haven't mastered political skills. Keep your hand up if you're still doing training, if you're doing training on organizational power and politics, and every hand goes down. And that I think is the problem, that we are not training people, with the skills that they need to survive in a world which is filled with imperfect people, with biases, with their own particular perspectives, with all kinds of the political challenges that we all face inside of large organizations, including, by the way, Stanford Business School, that we have sent people basically into battle without the weapons or the tools or the skills to actually succeed in that battle. And then we're surprised. Oh my God, Bill Gentry, who used to work for the Center for Creative Leadership, did a bunch of studies at the Center for Creative Leadership on career derailments. And of course, one of the number one reasons why careers get derailed is because they haven't mastered organizational power and politics. So give them the skills to do this. These are teachable skills. This isn't around, something about personality. These are all techniques and skills that can be learned. We ought to be training people. So the CHR people ought to, number one, master it. And number two, they ought to have development programs that teach people how to do power and influence.
Well, Jeffrey, I appreciate all the insights you've shared. You've given the audience a lot to think about. If they want to go deeper in your work, where I know, course, books, you podcasts, you have a lot out there. What is the best place for people to go to connect with all of your work?
Well, I think, I have a website, jeffreypfeffer.com, which has links to all of these resources. I do have a Pfeffer on Power podcast in which I interview interesting people, many of them former students, who talk about their path to power. And I think one of the things I'm proudest about of the Pfeffer on Power podcast, as you will see, African Americans, you will see women, you'll see Asian American women, you'll see Deb Liu, who is the CEO of Ancestry.com and was one of the most senior women at Facebook. You'll see my friend Benjamin Fernandez, who is in Tanzania starting a payments company. You'll see people, literally a very, very diverse set of people talking about what they have done to put into practice in a very practical way the power skills that they've learned and how and the lessons that they have for other people. The other day, I just did an interview with a Brazilian woman who sits on 10 boards, and will tell you that is, and many of them are public company boards. Will tell you about her path to power. So I tried through the Pfeffer on Power podcast to give people examples. So that would be a source of material. I post on LinkedIn all the time, but all this is accessible through the jeffreypfeffer.com, or people can send me an email. And, I'm happy to respond. I'm in the education business, so I'm happy to give people access and point them to resources that might be helpful to them.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And I will include links to all the sites that you mentioned in the show notes. So if you want to check those out, which you should, after you watch this episode, check that out. But Jeffrey, in the meantime, thank you so much for your work in this space. Thank you for making time to share it with us and helping us learn a little bit more about getting and leveraging power.
Thank you, Lars. It's been a pleasure talking with you.